Okay, so hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Families and Parenting ABCT Families and Parenting Special Interest Group. I'm Heather Risser and the current SIG leader for this ABCT fiscal year. Want to thank Rosanna, who is sort of helping me out a lot, and Lindsay Druskin, who is a grad student who, without her work, none of this would be possible. So today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Regine Galanti. Dr. Galanti is a licensed psychologist who specializes in treating anxiety, OCD, and behavioral. Oh, hello. So she's a licensed psychologist who specializes in treating anxiety, OCD, and behavior problems in children, teens, and adults. She's an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy and parent-child interaction therapy. Dr. Galanti is the founder of Long Island Behavioral Psychology, a therapy service, a therapy practice in Nassau County, Long Island. She's the author of Anxiety Relief for Teens, Essential CBT Skills, as well as When Harley Has Anxiety, a fun CBT skills activity book for overcoming worries and fears. Today's webinar will highlight topics from her new book, Parenting Anxious Kids, Understanding Anxiety in Children by Age and Stage. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Galanti. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the SIG for hosting this. I'm really excited to be here. And as I was saying, I don't actually use Zoom for work. I don't know if that's like okay to admit. So presenting on Zoom is always its own kind of anxiety for me because it's like the screen share is always very scary. So it's an exposure for me, but that gets into what I'm going to be talking about. So parenting anxious kids and what we do for anxiety as a treatment that works. So this is my new book. It's really exciting to say that it is out now. I wrote this book exactly to be able to reach more parents about this topic. So I'm really excited to talk about it. So I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to be a little bit interactive for a minute, if I can find the chat, and ask, what do you worry about as an adult? It seems like you're all adults. You might be, what's the word? You might be children at heart, but just put in the chat, like, what kind of stuff do you worry about? Okay, so children's health, that's a big one, and happiness. We'll jump right in there. Finances, retirement, money, a lot of things. Yeah, most things, love that. Meeting deadlines, marriage, future, children, like finances, Trump, getting subpoenaed. Whoa, that's a heavy one. All of these, there's a lot to worry about, right? Climate crisis, the list goes on and on. And when we think about what kids worry about, I think they worry about the same things. They worry about the same things that adults worry about. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because I think often as parents, we have a tendency to say things like, what does my kid have to worry about? They have it so easy. But kids worry about the same things that adults worry about. So that's one premise that I like to start with. And to broaden this a little bit and talk a little bit about how we talk about anxiety as psychologists, I like to think about, or I like to say that all emotions are normal. That is my starting premise when I'm doing therapy, that it is normal to feel anxious, and it would actually be problematic to not feel anxious. So if there is a tiger at my door, it would make sense to feel anxious, and it would be a good thing, because the person who doesn't feel anxious when they confront a tiger is the person who probably doesn't make it till tomorrow. So anxiety is a good thing, and anxiety-free living is not something that we strive for. So starting premise, I know maybe a lot of you are here to talk about like okay, so how do I parent my kids in a way that makes them not anxious at all? Like smooth the grade before them as a parent? That is not going to be this talk. And um, I don't think that that would be safe because those people from an adaptive perspective have kind of been like weeded out because the caveman who didn't respond to the tiger or the loud rustling in the grass probably got eaten. So they weren't there to like kind of pass on their genes to us and pass on that chillness. So anxiety is a normal response to threat and it's a healthy response to threat. But here's the problem. Sometimes the things we're anxious about are not actually threatening. So, for instance, um, speaking to you, speaking on Zoom, even though it's been right 4 years now, still feels like speaking into the void. And I hate that I get no feedback. It makes me really uncomfortable. It makes me anxious. But if I just shut down and turn off my computer now, what's going to happen is I am going to make the problem worse. Then it'll be really embarrassing for me, and my anxiety will probably skyrocket as the psychologist who was presenting on Zoom and then fell apart. So that running away that I would normally do, let's say for a tiger or a snake or something actually dangerous like a car barreling at me, would not be helpful in response to, let's say, a fear of public speaking. So sometimes anxiety is a false alarm. So I really like the metaphor of a smoke alarm for anxiety. So the idea is a smoke alarm is something helpful. If my smoke alarm is too sensitive in my house and I say, you know what, I'm just going to take it off the ceiling and I'm going to throw it in the garbage, what's going to happen is I am going to possibly miss a fire. And that's not good. That's a real threat. So I can't really do that. But sometimes I'm going to be cooking in the kitchen and my kitchen's going to fill with smoke because I don't know, something dripped in the oven and it made the smoke alarm go off. And in that case, there's no fire, but the response is the same. The smoke alarm is kind of like a dumb tool that's an on or off. It knows if there's smoke. It doesn't know if there's something actually to be concerned about. So when I'm thinking about anxiety, I'm thinking about it the same way. Is this anxiety helpful? Is it leading me towards a response to an actual danger? Or is it leading me towards a response that's telling me maybe something's wrong, but if I use my other senses and my logic, I'm going to say, I know that there's nothing wrong here. And often with problematic anxiety, what we're going to start doing is we're going to start reacting to those false alarms as if they are real alarms. So, kind of bringing this back to where I started, that all emotions are normal. It's normal to feel anxiety. It's normal for you to feel anxiety. It's normal for your kids to feel anxiety. That's not the problem. The problem is the reaction to the anxiety, what we do. If I have a broken smoke alarm that I'm calling 911 every time it goes off, and the fire trucks are coming blazing down my block, that's going to be a problem. If they're going to say, hey, nope, you left popcorn in the microwave 30 seconds too long, maybe don't do that next time. But if there's actually a problem, you want that reaction. So the other piece of anxiety I want to highlight right here is that when kids feel anxious, adults in their lives get anxious. We don't like to see our kids struggle, and we don't like to see them having a hard time. So when a child is saying, I don't want to go to school, this is just, I don't know, what if the other kids are going to make fun of me? As a parent, I have 3 kids. I'm going to start thinking, oh my gosh, my poor kid, like they are suffering. What am I going to do to relieve their suffering? And that's going to bring up my own anxiety response in kind of like as a parallel to my kids' anxiety response. And being aware as parents, what we feel is an important part of parenting an anxious kid. Because you have to know that when you're trying to swoop into action, when you're having a false alarm, because your kid is safe and you are safe, how do we respond to that? So go into this a little bit more kind of technically, I say, as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, this is the way I understand emotions. Most people, when I say, hey, anxiety, what is it? They think worries. Anxiety is that intellectual process of being stressed out about that thing in my future. It's all about my thoughts. but I treat very little kids and they get anxious too. So actually I was on a podcast yesterday where the host, who was a very intellectual, kind of heady guy, was saying, I know what my anxiety looks like. It's all in my head. But when I'm looking at my kids, they don't have that ability to sit there and like wax about the future. So like that what does even therapy look like with a kid? And what I said is exactly kind of what's on this slide, that anxiety is not just your thoughts. So we have those thoughts. We have that thought that like, hey, maybe I'm in danger. Maybe something happened to my kid. And those can be scary, but they're not the whole picture of the emotion. And the piece I think we often discount is the physical cues. So when you are anxious, when you are confronting a threat, it's a physical process too. We're going to have that fight or flight response. Our breathing is going to speed up. Our muscles are going to get tense. Our stomach might hurt. We are going to have that fight or flight response because it makes us move faster in response to danger. But again, remember, body kind of simple, like it's this response is not like, oh, false danger, I won't react like that. So when your child is anxious about going on a play date, they might have those same physical cues in the absence of real danger. So this kind of preview is something I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes, which is this idea that in little kids, we're often not looking for the thoughts. We're often using those physical cues as a way in to say, hey, this kid is anxious. And then the last piece, though definitely not least, because I am a behavioral therapist and behaviors is typically what I focus on all the time, is when you are anxious, you are going to want to do something. Whether or not you do it, you're going to have that urge to act. And often with anxiety, what we're talking about is trying to run away or avoid the problem. So another example, let's go a little bit older this time. So if you have a teen and they have a big assignment coming up and they're feeling really anxious about it, and maybe they're getting a little sweaty and a little tense, so those physical cues, one option might be like, hey, you know what, I'm really anxious about this assignment. I'm going to avoid it. I'm just going to push it off. I'm going to watch Netflix all night, and then I'll fix the problem because I won't have to face it. It's a great short-term solution, but the problem is that it doesn't actually solve the problem, and it actually makes things worse, which one of the big takeaways I like parents to get when I'm talking about anxiety is that when you allow a child to avoid the thing they're anxious about, you might fix the temporary problem because they didn't have to go on the play date, or they didn't have to study, or they didn't have to do the task in front of them. But it actually makes the problem worse long term because they don't learn how to handle their anxiety. They don't learn skills. So if you take nothing else from this talk, I want you to know that as parents, our job is to help our children by not being complicit in their anxiety, not engaging in this avoidance cycle in whatever way possible. And we will talk about strategies to do this. I'm not saying, okay, just cold turkey, cut out all the things you're doing to help your child when they're anxious. And I'm not saying that at all, because you should help your child when they're anxious, but don't help them avoid when they're anxious. That causes more problems. So let's get into what I mean here. Okay, a little more information about anxiety. This is a huge number, 30%. I want you to know that 30% of people will meet diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder over the course of their lifetime. So this is a huge number, and I share it because I think there's still a lot of stigma around mental health. So 1 in 3 people that you see, I don't know how many people are in this Zoom, but when I started, it was like 100 people. So we're talking about 33 people right here who meet diagnostic criteria, who will meet diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder at some point. This is not an academic thing. Like, this probably will affect somebody you know. And one of the most important things that, as a psychologist, I think is important to tell people is how we can distinguish between that regular emotion that I was just talking about and the more problematic anxiety. And I think the tricky part over the course of childhood is these symptoms change, which is why I spent probably a lot more time than you were interested in talking about the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to anxiety, because those change. But anxiety is made up of that constellation of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors And when you start recognizing that, it'll become easier to recognize anxiety at different points in time. So what does that look like? In different kids, it's going to look differently. So in toddlers, we expect toddlers to be afraid of loud noises. Again, these are expected anxiety. This is not anxiety that's a problem, because sometimes what parents will do is they'll come into my office and they'll say, hey, what should I expect from my child at this stage? And rarely, it happens very infrequently, but sometimes a parent will come in and they'll say, hey, my preschooler is afraid of imaginary things, and sometimes it keeps them from going to bed, but they normally don't have trouble with it, and it's just something they bring up. Should I be concerned? And if that's the only thing they're saying, I'll say, no, that's expected. We know that most kids are afraid of something. 90% of kids are worried about something, so it's normal to be somewhat worried. As you move up into the elementary school year, the fears become more realistic. So you're talking about fear of weather, or maybe some like concerns about health. And then tweens and teens are worried about social stuff, fitting in, making friends, academic success. And as you move up to emerging adults, because I consider them part of childhood, they're not really independent yet. These are your like 18 to 25-year-olds. Their anxieties typically revolve around achieving independence and being able to do independence tasks. So this is what normal anxiety looks like. But at each stage, we're also going to see different constellations of anxiety. So like I said, the younger the kid is, the more likely it is that their anxiety is not going to be, they're not going to be able to access the thoughts related to anxiety. And even if you can see that there are probably thoughts there. And if you have a very verbal 3-year-old, even sometimes they'll say, hey, I'm worried about this. But the thing that they're saying they're worried about doesn't seem to match up with what is actually making them anxious. So they're saying, I'm worried that my teacher is mean, but you see your kid in school and they have a great relationship with the teacher, and it doesn't seem like that's it. But at the same time, every time there's drop off, your child gets clingy and throws tantrums and saying, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. So you're seeing that behavioral avoidance that often, by the way, looks like more of a behavior problem in little kids, because kids can't avoid the same way adults avoid. If I don't want to do something, I can just get into my car and drive away. But if a toddler doesn't want to wants to avoid something, they don't have that same option of just walking away. So you're going to see more tantrums. And as you move up to, let's say, preschool and even elementary school, we're often going to see more of those somatic complaints. So again, like a kid who's going to complain, like, hey, I have a stomach ache, and they're going to say it Monday through Friday, but magically weekends, stomach ache goes away, no physical symptoms. So that's a common presentation of anxiety that I think most parents don't recognize. Um, and as you move up into kind of like elementary school, you might see some of those somatic complaints, but that's where it gets a little bit tricky. That some kids are very much will be able to access their thoughts and express them. And other kids are going to see maybe behavioral avoidance or somatic complaints. And then as you get into the teens and emerging adults, they typically do have more access to their thoughts, and you can engage them. But typically what I'm looking for is, what is the avoidance that I am seeing? So incomplete list based on what I just said about all the thoughts, physical feelings, and behaviors. And by the way, all these black and white graphs are from my new book. So I'm excited about it, and I always love graphic design and like pretty things. So I'm excited to have new graphs for my presentations based on my book. So you might see worries about danger, which I mentioned, or concern about bad things happening to other people, or perfectionism is also, we conceptualize it, or I conceptualize it as anxiety related. And perfectionism is interesting because often behaviorally, so you'll have the thoughts related to, I have to do this perfectly, but you'll also have some people who will be like, okay, so I'm going to study for 12 hours to do great on this exam. And then you might have others to say, I have two options, right? Perfectionism is, I need to be perfect. I know I can't put in the 12 hours I need to, so I'm going to put in 0 hours. So often parents get confused that perfectionism sometimes looks like complete failure, because people who are perfectionists, who are having those thoughts, are scared to even engage, because if they do it halfway, that would be terrible. So they don't try at all. So that's a common presentation. And again, concerns about the future, thoughts about being judged. You're going to see some of those physical cues. And again, you might see behaviors that you don't think of as anxiety. People think anxious kids look, for lack of a better word, worried. And sometimes they look worried, but sometimes they're throwing tantrums, and sometimes it means asking your parents for the same question 25 times, even though parents have answered that a lot. Sometimes it looks like low frustration tolerance, that a kid tried something once, they didn't do well, and now they kind of just lost it. So these are the kinds of things that I am looking for. Okay, so let's talk about parenting. So that was my overview. I keep, sorry, looking at my watch because I can talk about this for 6.5 hours, and I want to leave time for questions, which doesn't give me 6.5 hours, even if so. If anyone wants to take this offline, I'm happy to talk about it for another 5 hours. So my slide is not advancing. Why is it not advancing? There we go. So where do we learn our parenting from? All kinds of things, but I will tell you, this would be amazing if it happened, but you do not leave the hospital with the baby and a book on what to expect about what's about to happen. And I have noticed, again, more as a parent, that there are excellent books for the physical development of your child. You can find out the information of when my kid's supposed to roll over or when my kid's supposed to start solid foods. You can find that guidance, but finding guidance on social and emotional development is much, much harder, especially when your kid is over 5. Right? It's pretty okay. You know, like there are very distinct guidelines for separation anxiety and when stranger anxiety pops up. But I have looked, if anybody has resources on like developmental milestones on oral, social and emotional kind of areas that they send to families, please share them with me, because I have looked for these to share with anxious parents and I often can't find them. And again, part of the reason why I wrote this book is I know what anxiety looks like at each stage. So again, going back to, besides for that little tangent, where we learn our parenting from. So sometimes we learn from role models, like our parents, but sometimes, I didn't know how to say this, we like kind of learn as a reaction to those models. You say, oh, I don't want to parent the way my parents parented. I know that. I don't know what I want to do, but I know I don't want it to look like that. But we also learn how to parent from media, from Instagram, right? This is a big thing. Why I encourage a lot of my therapist colleagues to be more out there on social media is because this is where parents are getting their parenting information. And it is so, so hard to tell what's reliable or not. As an anxiety therapist who's on Instagram, I can attest to the fact that like a lot of the in parenting advice doesn't work for anxious kids. We know based on the research that anxious kids, there are evidence-based techniques that you can use and should use. And it doesn't always fit with the things that I am seeing on Instagram. And I know better. And sometimes I get taken in by the fact that the speaker is a really good speaker. And I agree with other things they say. So it's really hard to tease out this information. And then we also learn parenting from our values, from our culture, from our religion. Um, and it's really hard to take the time to say like, hey, how do I want to parent? First, where did I come from? And then where am I going? But I always encourage the parents in my office, and I'm going to encourage those of you who are parents who I'm speaking to today, to stop for a minute and say, hold on, what are my parenting goals? And what are my parenting values, which is different from goals? Those are the things that you find meaning in. So like, what's important to me as a parent? So a quick way to identify values. I'm just going to assume that a lot of you are coffee or tea drinkers, because when you're speaking to a room full of adults, it tends to be that a lot of us are. And if I was going to take, if you'd indulge me for less than 60 seconds to help identify like your values as a person, one values exercise I really like to do is to ask you, like, what was a meaningful, specifically cup of coffee or tea that you've had? it shouldn't be about the taste of the coffee or tea. It should really be about the experience, who you're with, and where you are. Um, when I do this exercise, at least lately when I do this exercise, I think about sharing a cup of coffee in Scotland with my husband this summer, because that relationship is important to me and travel is important to me. And for me, this exercise is a quick way to say, like, oh, yeah, those things are important to me. How am I orienting my life towards those things? Um, so I think that as parents, we have these dual hats. We have our values as our own people, and then we have our values in relationship to our children. And variation on that same exercise is I'll often ask the parents in my office, what can you describe to me a meaningful moment that you've had with your family? Um, just think about it, and it doesn't have to be a big moment. It can be something small. But identifying, kind of like giving yourself an anchor to say, oh, look, I really liked when we were celebrating my daughter's birthday and we were all together and acting silly in the kitchen. Um, and maybe that to me represents like the it's important to me to have all my children together, and I liked it that everybody was screen free and interacting with each other. And that kind of moment, or those kind of moments, help give you the anchor to say, hey, this is what is important to me as a parent. Um, Spending time to identify these values is, I think, very helpful in therapy or as a parent, because values are beacons. They give us direction. They help orient us towards, this is what I want my parenting to look like. This is how I want my kids to remember me. An anxiety therapist, I often specialize in helping kids and adults face their fears. So I sometimes take this values exercise in a little bit of a more morbid direction and ask, how do you want your kids to remember you at your funeral? What do you want them to say about you? But any of these exercises that work for you is a good way to say, what what's important to me? What do I want out of my parenting? And with parents of anxious kids, I especially like to focus for a few minutes on values, because anxiety often gets in the way of those values. A lot of times when you're parenting an anxious kid, it's their anxiety that's running the show and not anything that's important to you. It's true, protecting your kid from their anxiety is can be something that's very important to you. But if you're going to think about how to help them manage their anxiety and get over it long term, that um, the 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 protecting your kid in a moment from anxiety is not the thing that's going to help. Um, so I like to highlight that there is that distinction. I can protect a kid from going on a play date right now, and they will feel good. But if I want that child to grow up to be a resilient, healthy child who can manage difficult emotions, I'm going to have to act differently in reaction, in response to my values, to make lasting change. And the last thing I'm going to say about values, just jumping ahead, because I really like, when I'm focusing on parents, I don't like to only focus on little kids, because again, I think there's a lot more guidance out there for little kids and older kids. Um, Starting at kind of tween to teen and up, sometimes our kids have different values, and that can be really hard for us. But helping yourself recognize what's important to me and also what's important to them, can be a really good um, starting place to as a parent. Um, so now you got that out of the way, you know your values. Let's talk about how parents can contribute to child anxiety. So I like to point out to parents that you bring your own risks and vulnerabilities to parenting. It's just life. You have your own genetic makeup. If you are anxious, you might pass that on to your kids, even if you're doing everything right. Um, I'm an anxiety therapist. I specialize in this. Some of my kids are anxious. It's okay. It's just the way it is. Um, so, like I said, all emotions are okay. So if you feel guilt about that, like, I'm not going to tell you don't feel guilty because I try not to invalidate people's emotions, but I will say that is an unavoidable part of just being a human being, that we bring our lives and our vulnerabilities to our parenting. And we can either, let's say, do values exercises, figure out what kind of parent we want to be and change that, or we can be sad that we gave our kids vulnerabilities that we don't like. Um, so we can work on changes, we can change our behaviors or not. But you're going to bring your own stuff to your parenting. There's no way around it. So these are the ways that, based on, I should say that this whole book and this whole lecture is based on research from people who have done amazing stuff in the cognitive behavioral therapy community. My specialty is talking about the stuff that other people do in plain language, but I am not a researcher. So I am standing on the shoulders of many other people who have done this work. So let's talk about how parents can contribute to child anxiety. So based on the research, these are the five, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that I've identified that are typical traps that parents fall into. One is the intolerance of negative emotion, right? When your kid starts crying and you as a parent say, "You're fine, don't cry." Like, as an adult, if I'm crying because I'm sad about something and my friend's like, "No, just back up, you're fine." I might reconsider my friendship, right? I would much rather hang out with someone who's going to say like, "Oh, you had a really hard day at work. Your boss was really like, terrible to you." In my case, this is funny because I work for myself. So this would be a very self-critical and probably sometimes realistic view, but I'd have no one to blame. But a lot of times we have a hard time tolerating negative emotion in our kids. Second way is avoiding risk, right? Are you sure you can handle that party? Are you sure you'll be okay? Like maybe you can't jump from that step. So super common. Another thing is sometimes we're really inconsistent as parents. Sometimes you let your kid sleep in your bed, but other times, nope, absolutely not. You're going back to your bed. So it's really hard for kids to know what the line is when the line changes depending on how tired you are. Um, Fourth way is accommodation. This is a big buzzword in the parenting anxious kids space, but it's the stuff that you do for your anxious kid that you wouldn't do for a non-anxious kid. So again, the stuff you do to kind of be complicit with your child's anxiety. Taking the school bus makes you anxious? Don't worry, I'll drive you. Great short term. Long term, how is your kid going to learn how to take the bus? And finally, I'll mention this one, modeling anxious behavior. So you have to face your fears, but oh my gosh, like I'm just going to text her to make sure nothing happened. She's 5 minutes late. So you're modeling your own anxiety, or you burn dinner and you're like, I am such a screw up. I can't believe I did that again. But when your kid screws up, you're like, no, it's okay. Practice makes perfect. So you can talk the talk, but you're not really walking the walk. Kids pick up on this. Kids are amazing BS detectors. So if you are being inconsistent, they're going to pick up on it and they're going to learn what you're showing them, not what you're telling them. So what can we do about it? We all do some of those things, by the way, sometimes. Like, again, I often think my patients will say like, "Oh, you must be such a good mom. You probably like do everything right." And absolutely not. I think I'm probably a worse mother because I know all these things and I'm not always doing them because I have feelings also. So I would say at least you don't know better. When you know better, a lot of the tricks that we use to be a good parent to an anxious kid um, are easy to understand but hard to implement. So your job or my ask of you would be figure out what's helpful for you in this from this talk and take one thing that you can take away and practice that one thing, because you're not going to change your parenting after even the most amazing 1 hour lecture. um, Change takes time and change is a stepwise process. So if you're hearing all those 5 things that I just said and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm the worst parent in the world, like, first of all, that's probably being a little too hard on yourself. But the second thing is change starts small. So pick one thing to change and work on that. Okay, so what can you do to parent anxious kids to help them? So I just noticed the slide says 111. It's supposed to say 123. But anyway, so we're going to, so this is me kind of leaving the mistake and practicing kind of being comfortable with that in front of a bunch of people. Even though I do have that behavioral urge to like kind of X out, change it really quickly, but I'm not going to do that. It's fine. Or even if it's not fine, I can handle it. So that was modeling. That's what I might do to it in front of my kids if I made a mistake, even if I don't feel it. I don't want to like full out explode, but I want to be able to model and talk in that way. So what we want to do is we want to build and maintain strong relationships with our kids because we know that that is the foundation. Whenever I'm talking about helping kids face their fears, parents will be like, oh my God, but if I help them face their fears, I'm going to feel terrible in the moment. And my solution is generally to help them identify that we have so many other moments. And this one painful moment as a parent is not going to ruin your relationship with your kid if you are working on that relationship. So step number 2, don't be complicit with your child's anxiety. And then step number 3 is actively help your child build independence and face fears. I'm going to go through these a little bit. So don't worry about it. So building and maintaining a strong relationship with your child. What does that look like? When your kid is young, it means making time for them. I'm a parent-child interaction therapist or PCIT therapist. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a therapy that works for disruptive behavior disorders for typically kids under 7. And one of the tenets we know for kids with behavior problems is that the first step we want to do is one-on-one time with your kid, 5 minutes every day. So the therapy is designed for toddlers and preschoolers, but honestly, the idea of special time, that one-on-one playtime where you follow a kid's lead, you can do this for kids as long as kind of they'll let you. And even if they don't let you, like making time is important. It's hard to have a really solid relationship if you don't have the time. And then as your kid grows, also make sure you have opportunities for open communication. This is beyond the how was your day? What did you do? Because again, could be my own kids, but when they walk in the door and I'm like, how was your day? It's always good. Even if they're the worst day ever, I'm getting good first. Maybe like later in the night, I'll get the details, but that is not what I mean by open communication. Open communication means like phone free time when you are making it very clear that you are there for them and interested in their lives. During both these times, special time and then in open communication as a kid grows. What you want to be doing is a lot of labeled praise. Labeled praise means specific praise for the things that you're seeing. This is a skill that we use over and over in building relationships and also in helping an anxious kid, because what we want to be able to do is catch your kid being good. Catch your kid being brave. Catch your kid doing the things that are inconsistent with their anxiety. As parents, we have a tendency to say, like, to comment on the things that we think our kids need to improve. And often in a kind of critical way, like, oh, why can't you just go to the birthday party? Why can't you be brave? But if they do something, you're like, oh, maybe they didn't notice that they tried out for the basketball team and that's inconsistent with what they would normally do. I just won't say anything. So I'm going to encourage any parent to always say something, to say, I'm so proud of you that you tried out for the basketball team, even though there were a lot of people there. Great job saying hi to that stranger. I know sometimes that's hard for you. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but you should comment on it. Another skill you should use is validation. So when I think validation, I'm thinking like telling a kid you heard them. So sometimes that means repeating what they say. Like, oh, so what you're saying is you feel really uncomfortable with this assignment. Or what you're saying is that your sister really insulted you. Or even what you're saying is that you were really upset that I made the decision to wake you up at 10 o'clock to take you to your friend's house. That's teenagers. Teenagers often, the validation is hard. So two of the ways that I like to validate or start the process towards validating is emotion labeling. From when a kid is a baby, you can do this. Emotion labeling literally means labeling the emotions that you're seeing. It looks like you're anxious. I'm feeling anxious. being able to run a home that uses emotion words. I'm sad right now because X. Sometimes kids don't react well to this. No, I'm not sad. Okay, fine. I thought you were sad because your eyes were a little teary. I'm wrong. You don't have to hit kids over the head with this, but creating an environment where it's okay to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing is okay. And another skill I use to build strong relationships and also help an anxious kid is use supportive language. So supportive language means being able to tell a kid like, hey, I know that that this is hard for you, and I know you can do it. So this is stuff from Ellie Leibowitz's kind of space program. If there's any psychologists who are on here who are saying, hey, this sounds familiar. But the idea is with an anxious kid, we want to create this environment where we're having a solid relationship. And we also, again, getting into kind of two, we don't want to be complicit with a child's anxiety. So being able to encourage a kid like, hey, I know you can do this. Like, I know you can handle this. Showing our own confidence in a kid is an important part of parenting an anxious kid. So when I say don't be complicit with your child's anxiety, when a kid is young, that means, or even older, it means setting limits. So making sure that you are creating structure to allow for flexibility within the structure for a child. That if a child knows, kids generally do better with structure. I do better with structure too. So it's not only kids that do better with structure, but if a kid knows that this is when bedtime is and this is when meal times are, one can reduce anxiety because they know what to expect, but being flexible a little bit within that can also help an anxious kid. Setting boundaries, parents often worry that if they set boundaries, it will push a kid away. And in my experience, it's kind of the opposite. That if I tell a kid like, no, this is the last time I'm walking you back to your room, and I hold to that instead of that inconsistency that I talked about at the beginning. Kids learn like, oh, okay, like this is the rule that I'm going to have to go by. And it might be uncomfortable. And again, one of the behaviors that anxiety pulls for is fight or flight. So fighting for a kid means fighting against you. That if their anxiety is telling them like I am never going to sleep tonight, and so you need to be with me, mom, while I'm not sleeping. You setting the boundary of sorry, I'm closing my door, I'm going to bed, might lead to that fight or response. They might fight against you, and that's okay. That's what they're supposed to do. Your job is not being complicit with that, to say like, okay, I love you, I know you can do this, and closing the door. If that's what you're working on. I'm not saying just like, like lock your kids out all the time. I'm saying in a specific environment where we're trying to change that behavior. And one of the other ways I'm going to encourage parents to not be complicit with your child's anxiety is to reduce accommodation. So the example I was giving was driving your kid to school instead of taking the bus because they're anxious. So if there are things that you do in the service of your child's anxiety that you would not do if your child was not anxious, are there any steps that you can take to cut that out? And it can be very, very slowly. It could be, well, my kid requires 7 wake ups starting at 6 o'clock, and it has to be gentle. And if I don't do it exactly the right way, they won't go to school. Thinking through like, hey, what can I cut? What can I cut out? How can I change my own behavior so I can help my kid rise to the occasion? Because often when adults are anxious, we're anxious all by ourselves. We don't bring anyone down with us. But kids bring down the whole village. They involve the siblings, they invite the parents, sometimes they're the grandparents involved. And if we can pull ourselves out of that equation, it's actually really healthy for kids. It helps them say, like, hey, my parents think I can do this. I'm feeling really anxious. I don't think I can do it. But if everybody else in my life thinks I can do this, like maybe I can. And creating environments where you are pushing kids to stretch and try new things and be curious about their world. Okay, step 3. Actively building your child's independence. So often with anxious kids, the anxiety keeps them laser focused on avoiding the thing that they are anxious about. But there's so much else in their lives that sometimes gets affected too. So kid, let's say, is anxious about going on play dates, but also doesn't walk to the corner to the like corner store to get a drink because he'd have to talk to a stranger, but would really love to buy a soda. So how can I help build that child's independence so that so that your child takes a little bit of risks or push your child a little bit? And I think that like I hate to be a kids these days kind of adult, but growing up without a cell phone, these are things that like when my friends and I look back on and we're like, I don't know, we just met somehow and we figured it out. Um, Kids don't always have the ability these days to do the independence tasks on their own that naturally children used to have to do. And I'm not even saying they should. I'm not going to take my teen's phone and be like, hey, find your way home. That doesn't seem like a great idea. But what I will do and encourage parents to do is think about what milestones you want your kid to get to. Let's say you have a teenager who's going off to college. And when they're in college, they're going to have to do their laundry and they're going to have to cook and they're going to have to do all these tasks. Are they set up for those things? And how can I help them by, let's say, making them bring their laundry downstairs today? And sometimes we want to scaffold this skill. We want to help the kid succeed by saying, okay, maybe step one is you bring your laundry down and then I do it. And then step two is you put it in the wash or you move it from the washer to the dryer, but I do it. But by scaffolding those independence skills, we're going to give kids more of the ability to be able to do the things that they want to do and have confidence that they can do those things. And the way I conceptualize this is, again, I go back to development. Like, what are other kids that age doing? And is my kid doing it themselves too? And if my kid is not, how can I encourage them through my behaviors, not only my words, to do those things? If, all my kids' friends are making plans on their own, but I'm still texting the other parents to make plans, how do I get my kid to the point where they can do that task by themselves or manage money or make phone calls, which I know is like probably a dying skill. But those tend to be the areas that I'm going to encourage parents to focus on. And then the last point I want to make is also, how as a parent can you model coping behaviors? Right? Think about this for a minute. How do I react to sadness, to scary things, to perfection, to frustration? How do we react to our own anxieties? Because if you are reacting in exactly the way you don't want your child to react, that is, like I said, what they are going to learn. So being able to focus on yourself and say, how can I do things differently to show up for my child and be the parent my kid needs me to be will go a very long way. So this is just the other half of the graph I showed you a couple slides ago. Instead of just how parents can contribute to anxiety, the way parents can help is literally the opposite of those things. So instead of intolerance to negative emotion, help a kid talk about emotion. Instead of avoiding risk, help kids take risk. And instead of inconsistency, how do I set routines? Instead of accommodating, how do I cut out avoidance? I know you can handle the bus ride, so I'm not going to drive you. And instead of modeling anxious behaviors, how can we model coping behaviors, right? I'm a little bit late, like mom's a little bit late. Maybe she hit traffic, like, or even saying, I'm a little anxious about that, but I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to try to calm my body. It's okay. Yeah, or I will be okay, even if I don't feel okay right now. And just in order to find me, these are my books. This is my contact information. Feel free to like contact me, however, for follow-up questions and whatever. And I think I have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, I will stop the share. I feel like I threw a lot out there.
I have one question. Can you share the slide that was early on that was the different behaviors from anxiety. I think there was like avoidance, low frustration tolerance, stuff like that. I just didn't catch all of that.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Where was it? This one?
Yes, that was it. Thank you.
Perfect. Someone asked if stealing is a symptom of anxiety. Um, Generally, it's not a common one. Unless when I think of anxiety, I always think about like the emotion comes first. So like if the kid didn't steal, how would they feel? Like what's driving the stealing? Um, like in theory, if it's like if I don't, like I can imagine that being more of an OCD symptom in a certain situation, but it's not a typical symptom that we see. When someone asks for my contact information, I'll just pull up that
Yes.
slide
Hi.
again.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question about this slide, actually. My son, the physical cues slide.
Mm-hmm.
My son really experiences mostly the nausea, upset stomach. And so is it, could that be just cross-cutting through all different scenarios? Because I rarely hear about headaches or some of those other symptoms as much as it's always usually like an upset stomach.
Right, that's normal. That's part of fight or flight. Our digestive system speeds up when we're anxious. Literally, some adults will get diarrhea like when they are anxious, running to the bathroom constantly. Um, I would also just like to make the point that just because they're having the physical symptoms because of anxiety doesn't make the physical symptoms any less real. These symptoms are actually happening. It's more that your stomach is a second brain. So learning to manage the anxiety will get rid of the stomach aches, but it's more of a long-term goal. It's short term, how do I function with the symptoms? Sometimes when I present, I'm anxious, my muscles get tight. If I focus on relaxing my muscles before I present, I'm probably going to lose. So it's more, sometimes we got to do it scared.
Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Galanti. I have a question. Thank
Sure.
you so much for this presentation. It's really informative and helpful. And I got this book before
Oh, yay.
for this and try to read it quickly because I thought like this is a golden chance to ask you if something, was of my concern. So I was reading this chapter 3 about the socialization skill, like in family settings, which I often find myself, like my daughter has social anxiety. So often like people are greeting her, she would kind of not like immediately say hello or hi, although she has become so much better now to do that. But sometimes, in new settings, even within your own family, like, it's kind of like an anxious moment for my daughter. So, and then all family members don't understand this, and they obviously don't have the information, dealing with anxiety is actually, like you said, you need skills that need to be learned and, expertise that you have to gather to help your kids. So one of the things you said was it's your job as a parent to allow your child to get comfortable at their own pace, right? So do we let them naturally help get comfortable with the new situation, like, or how do we also support them at the same time, like to get comfortable, like say with a new
Right.
family member
So I
without
think it means,
pressuring them, like
right, I
without.
think you need to be an advocate for your child to say like, hey, my daughter needs a few minutes, like back off, not in those words. But often, again, that brings up our own anxieties as parents that like you have a grandparent coming in and saying, give me a hug. And like I almost picture like the zombie movies that they're
That's
coming at
always
you,
the case with us, like, oh, why are you not saying hello to the grandmom,
Right,
that's very
right. So
rude.
I think of it
That's
as like, as much as I am a fan of reducing accommodation, like it is a stepwise process. So like it's okay for a kid to take a few minutes and you getting in the way to be like, she will say hi to you when she is ready. I'm sorry. Like probably not even the I'm sorry. I think this I'm sorry piece is coming from the fact that I can totally relate to this sometimes, right? Sometimes you have family members who are just way more assertive or aggressive than your kid is ready for. And it's your job to really, in that moment, protect your kid while encouraging your child to take that step to say hello. But
How do you exactly help her to say hello? Like, what are the exact words? I'm always trying to struggle to find the correct words. Like,
I would say role play before. You're gonna see grandma.
oh,
I'm grandma. Let's practice saying hi.
okay, all right, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we could totally send out the slides. When I use the Harley workbook with a child, it's more like I sometimes even couch it in terms of like we are very transparent with anxious kids. I've noticed you're struggling with X, and I found this book, and I think it'll be helpful. We're gonna spend 10 minutes every day and work on it. Honestly, it's sometimes when my 6-year-old is anxious, what she'll do is she'll just pull like her Harley book off the shelf and be like, "Can we do Harley?" And it's a little bit of mix of like the special time and her telling her telling me what she needs, because she's not a kid who will say, "Hey, I'm anxious," but she will come to me with the book, and that's the signal that oh, okay, I missed something. I need to be more aware of this. I don't want to keep people, but thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate like the people like the ABCT parenting and family SIG being able to bring me in and to talk about this. And I think they're going to be sending out my publisher has a 20% off code to my new book that you are welcome to use if you're interested in hearing more about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galanti. This was amazing. We really appreciate you joining us today.